Hello, booze and ghouls. It is once again the most magical season of the year, Halloween time. Now, I have lived in Pennsylvania for about 8 years now. And this year I have decided to embrace my current home state's spooky heritage. Pennsylvania has produced a lot of great horror over the centuries, right? From the first Gothic novel written in the United States, Charles Brockden Brown's Wyland, stay tuned for a video about that one, up through, say, the birth of the modern zombie movie with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. I've already done a video about Night of the Living Dead, but I will have another video coming up about a Romero film this season. And so Pennsylvania has this great heritage of horror, and that's what we're going to talk about this spooky season. In this video, we're going to talk about James Morrow's novel, This Is the Way the World Ends. This is the second of Morrow's novels that I've read, and I like this one a lot more than I liked the first one that I read. The first one that I read by James Morrow, I can't remember the title of it exactly off the top of my head. I think it was The Asylum of Dr. Caligari. I wasn't that big a fan of it. In part because it wasn't what I was expecting, and in part because I felt like there were some weird plot holes and issues with it. But with This Is the Way the World Ends, I very much enjoyed this one, and I do think a lot of that was my own sort of reader response of what I was expecting from a Caligari adaptation versus coming into this one without having those expectations. So, this is a post-apocalyptic nuclear holocaust novel. So right off the bat, you know it's going to be fun. It has a frame narrative. But basically, what we are getting is a story told by Nostradamus to a young kid. And this is Nostradamus's vision of the future. The novel itself, and interestingly enough, the Nostradamus that we get here is much more open about his prophetic gifts than I think the actual Nostradamus was. Like, I think this was basically sort of a secret because this was in the age of the Inquisition, where being able to predict the future was not necessarily seen as a positive thing. And this is a Nostradamus who's very cynical about what he does. Like, he makes it very clear that he does what he does to make money, and he's not really concerned with the truth value of his assertions so much as whether or not he can profit from them and whether or not people are going to be happy with them. So that's the sort of frame narrative. The story itself is about a guy named George Paxton, who's from Massachusetts. He is a New England Unitarian who takes great delight in the simple pleasures of life. And Morrow is from Pennsylvania, which is why he's included in my Pennsylvania horror series. He is from Philadelphia. At least for a little while, he did live in Massachusetts. I don't know how long he was in Massachusetts, and I actually don't know where he currently lives, although my sense was that he lived now somewhere back in Pennsylvania, somewhere around central Pennsylvania, but I may be wrong about that. But it doesn't really matter. But George is a tombstone engraver. And it's the Cold War, and so nuclear annihilation, the threat of nuclear annihilation hangs over the world, when a new technology comes out called the Scopus suit. This is a suit that promises to basically protect the individual wearer from any of the results of a nuclear attack, short of basically being directly hit by a nuclear bomb. The Scopus suits are relatively pricey, and George cannot afford them for himself and his family. But when an old woman comes in to the tombstone engravery, the shop, whatever I can't think of the word for a tombstone engraver's shop, but you know what I mean. She's basically like, listen, if you compose these epitaphs for my parents, then I will get you a free Scopus suit for your daughter. And that's what George really wants, is he wants to make sure that his daughter Holly is protected. So he composes these epitaphs almost by accident. The old woman pays him to make the gravestone with the etching, and then basically says, go to Boston and go to this shop, and you will get a free Scopus suit. George does. He arrives at this place. Let me see if I can find the proper name of it. The Mad Tea Party, Remarkable Things for Human Bodies, run by a guy named Theophilus Carter, who's the Mad Hatter, hence. Carter is this sort of insane guy who makes these very distinctive costumes and hats and all of this stuff. And he presents George with a one-of-a-kind gold child's Scopus suit, and he has him sign a sales contract. And the sales contract says, by affixing my name to this agreement, which entitles me to receive one Scopus suit free of charge, I hereby confess to my complicity in the nuclear arms race. I, the signatory, am fully aware that the prevalence of these suits emboldens our society's leaders to pursue a policy of nuclear brinksmanship. I am further aware that these suits are a public opiate, numbing our society to the dangers inherent in the following: the failure of the stable agreements to constrain meaningfully the arsenals of the superpowers, the ongoing refinement of the March Plan for waging a limited nuclear war, the refusal of the current administration to adopt a no-first-use policy regarding theater nuclear forces, and the continued development by the United States and the Soviet Union of first-strike intercontinental ballistic missiles with multiple warheads. So basically, all George has to do to get this free Scopus suit for his daughter, which is the thing that he wants for her almost more than anything else, is to sign this contract saying he is aware of the devastating results of a nuclear war, and that the ownership, promulgation, etc. of Scopus suits contributes to politics that lead toward that nuclear annihilation. George is uncertain about this, but signs the contract because he wants the Scopus suit for his daughter. On his way back from Boston, nuclear war breaks out. And basically it is a globally devastating nuclear war. It seems seemingly the majority of the world's population is wiped out in the initial blasts, and then the subsequent issues of like nuclear winter, the freezing of the ground, preventing the growth of crops, radiation, and then the burning away of the ozone, allowing massive amounts of ultraviolet light to flood the planet. All of these things Morrow describes in really quite harrowing detail. I mean, for a novel from 1986, if you wanted a good reason to be afraid of nuclear war, boy howdy, this is the way the world ends delivers it. There are some very, very, very brutal, graphic descriptions of people suffering direct burns from nuclear blasts, people suffering radiation sickness, etc., etc. But George, despite his small hometown in Massachusetts being hit with 2 warheads, George does not die. He is instead taken on the submarine, the city of New York, along with a set of other people. Robert Wengernook, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's a fictional name anyway. Brian Overwhite, Major General Robert Tarmac, and Dr. William Ranstable, and Reverend Peter Sparrow are the 5 other people who are rescued along with George. And they are to be taken to the Antarctic. All of these people were in some way nationally significant. Wengernook was Department of Defense, I think. So he was a politician, Secretary of Defense, I think, or Assistant Secretary of Defense, something like that. I can't exactly remember. Brian Overwhite was central in negotiating a number of nuclear treaties that didn't necessarily do all that much to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Roger Tarmac was an Air Force general who was sort of central to theorizing a more aggressive nuclear policy on behalf of the U.S. William Ranstable was a sort of child wonderkind who helped develop more efficient and therefore more targetable nuclear weapons. And Reverend Peter Sparrow, the very sort of fire and brimstone preacher who preached basically a sort of doctrine of the success of Christianity through nuclear war, and how it was God's plan was for America to succeed by defeating the Soviet Union, etc., etc. So all of these people were in some way engaged in the construction of a nuclear world, right? They all contributed to the situation that leads to this nuclear Armageddon. George Paxton is there because he has signed this sales contract. And what we find out is that the people who have brought them to Antarctica on this sub, as the world is experiencing these sort of crazy cataclysmic results of a global nuclear disaster, that these are not people in the traditional sense, that they are... Morrow uses the word race. I don't know if that's exactly right, but they are what's called the unadmitted. So basically, the unadmitted are a sort of weird quantum mechanical cosmic accident, wherein out of the ice of Antarctica, for reasons that are never really explained or even speculated about, are sort of emerge these people who never got to live. So maybe their parents had died before. So basically, it's a sort of imagination of all of the future generations that would have existed. A physicalized embodiment of the future of the species, of the future of the human species as such. And they identified these 6 men as primary drivers of the destruction of the future. and they put them on trial. So the indictments are crimes against peace, planning and preparing. This is count one. Crimes against peace, planning and preparing for a war of aggression, whether or not in violation of the domestic laws of a defendant's country of citizenship. Count two, war crimes, deploying weapons explicitly designed for the wanton destruction of cities, for the slaughter of civilian populations, and for other violations of the laws and customs of war. Count three, crimes against humanity, namely biosphere mutilation, radiation poisoning, superfluous injury, unnecessary suffering, and other cruel and barbaric acts. And count four, crimes against the future, namely planning and preparing for a war of extinction against the human species. So much of the novel, the last half of it especially, focuses on the trial of these guys by the unadmitted. And it's a philosophically interesting thing because it works through these questions of the nature of guilt, the nature of justice, the role of deterrence in protecting peace, whether or not the preparation for violent action can itself be a peacemaking tool, and whether or not people can be held responsible for a thing that they were trying to prevent that happened regardless. So we get the trial of all of these different guys, right? Each of them, so the prosecution brings in their witnesses who talk about how if they had gotten to live, one of them, if he had gotten to live, he would have negotiated treaties that would have led to nuclear disarmament. And the prosecution's case is that it is possible to do this through negotiation, through discussion, through diplomacy, rather than depending on nuclear arsenals for deterrence. And then the men themselves get to testify, and they make their cases that, from their perspectives, the only way to ensure peace was the set of actions that they took. They make the argument that it was not feasible or practical to try and negotiate with the Soviet Union, and there is a very anti-Soviet bias throughout this novel. I mean, again, it's an American author and a novel written in 1986, so that's not really that shocking, but there's very little questioning or discussion or consideration of whether or not the Soviet perspective had any merit. It's simply just sort of accepted that the Soviets were the bad guys, and the question that is asked is not, did the Soviets have rational reasons for what they were doing in the nuclear arms race, or did the U.S. have no choice but to deter through the threat of overwhelming force? That question is kind of never asked, which I think is a really interesting one. The idea that the Soviets are just sort of accepted as this malignant, violent evil that can only be dealt with through violence. And of course, especially from the perspective of 2025, with hindsight, looking back at events like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. tendency to see our opponents, whether those are military opponents or ideological opponents, as purely evil is massively detrimental in terms of U.S. global policy. But the novel takes us through all of these arguments, and it's really, really fascinating. As all of this is going on, George, whose wife and daughter are dead, has been given this small glass painting by Leonardo da Vinci, who painted this scene at the behest of Nostradamus. So Nostradamus had da Vinci paint a bunch of scenes, like 100, basically slides, that he uses in a slide projector as he tells the story of the end of the world. And this one is of George with the psychotherapist that was treating all of these men on the submarine, and what appears to be George's daughter, Holly, or a very similar child whom George decides will be named Aubrey. And so George is convinced that he will have a family with this woman, with Morning, I can't remember her last name off the top of my head, but he's convinced that they will be together and they will have a child, and that maybe they will rebuild the human race. And so George is constantly sort of motivated toward that as this novel goes on. And I'm not going to spoil it, I guess. Things don't go the way that George envisions. He has a very, very complicated end of existence. But it's really, really an interesting novel. It's philosophically interesting. It's sort of politically interesting. It brings us into interesting realms of psychology and what it means to be in conflict.